I want to describe to you two classifications of things that happen and what their significance is. I think there's a lot of, they're used a lot, but it's not easy to spell out exactly what the consequences are. Let's start with means and ends. Without going into philosophically difficult and controversial areas, means and ends describe the attitudes that people have toward things that they do. And to say that an action was a means for this agent, that's what he was doing it as, means that he was trying to accomplish something, and this was a way to accomplish that. To call something an end means that he is trying to accomplish it, and even if it never led to anything else at all, even if it was the very last thing that happened in his lifetime, it would be valuable. Now, the immediate difference between means and ends is if A is performed as a means to get to B, it's always possible that the agent will sacrifice A, either, for example, because B becomes impossible, so that A, in fact, won't bring him to B, or he finds some other way to get to B, which is preferable for some reason. So his commitment to A is only a conditional commitment. It's not an absolute commitment. Whereas something's an end, he wants it for itself. Relationships with other things is not going to change his desire to get it. It might be incompatible with other things, and that may make it force him to choose. So there is a real difference in a person's acting between what he's using as a means and what he treats as an end. Now, having said that, there is something which was discussed for decades, especially when the communists were in power, which I think, in spite of the fact that means and ends are really different, raised the question, which was an illegitimate question. The question was, does the end justify the means? The other thought was, well, the means may have bad effects, bad aspects, but if the ends are good enough, maybe that justifies using the means. I think that at the very least, that question is profoundly misleading. Because in terms of deciding what to do, the difference between means and ends should play no role at all. Whether it acts as a means or an end should play no role at all. Rather, the way you should look at it is, let's say, to make it easy, I have two alternative courses of action. This course of action involves these and these actions of mine and these consequences. That course of action involves those and those actions of mine and those consequences. Take a look at the entire expected outcome of each course of action, weigh up what you think its total value is, and choose the one that has the higher total value. I'm talking as a consequentialist now. I know the deontologist also, and that makes it more complicated, but let's just think in terms of how you're going to judge the consequences of what you do. When you look at each of the alternatives and consider the entire expected future, the division of that future course of affairs into some are means and some are ends plays no reasonable role whatsoever. That should not be a matter of concern at all. And the question of whether, well, let's see, these are only means, and these are ends, and now could the ends justify the means, and that would help me decide what to do, I think that's at the very best just profoundly misleading and could lead a person to a wrong conclusion. So let's take an example. A person has gangrene in his foot. Goes to the doctor. The doctor says, look, you got two alternatives. You could do nothing and die, or you can have surgery, which is painful, and to be an amputation, and you'll be permanently impaired for life, but you'll live. Those are your two alternatives. Well, given those two alternatives, almost everybody agrees it's preferable to have the surgery. Living without a foot for another 30 years is better than dying now. Right? That's what somebody says, yeah, but look, you overlooked something crucial here. The surgery is only a means, and the preserved life is the end. So what you really need to ask is, does the end justify the means? Does that help you make the decision? Would that change your mind? Could you possibly say, oh, I forgot to take that into account. You're right, let's see. Does the end justify the means? No, so I'd rather die. I don't think that's going to happen. What you really want to do is look at no surgery and what the expected future is, and then surgery, what the expected future is, and weigh up the value of the two futures. So asking whether the ends justify the means seems to be should just be stricken for the record. All you want to do is look at what the course of your operation is and what is the consequences that are expected from it, and weigh up its value. Anyway, that's the introduction to the idea of means and ends. Yeah.
But in that case, how does the end not justify the means for the surgery? The end is he lives. The means is he cuts off the foot.
I think that in deciding what to do, that observation plays no role. Suppose I never heard of ends and means. So they didn't classify things into ends and means. Never heard of the concepts. Would I be crippled in making the decision? Why couldn't they just say, one option is to die next month, and the other option is to have surgery and live for 30 years? Wouldn't that enable me to rationally make the right decision? Where does the distinction between means and ends play a necessary role in making a rational decision? I think it plays no role at all.
Ever?
I think so. That's right. All you need to do is look at the expected future and give it a value, and then pick the one with the greater value. Dividing up the future into some actions being means and other actions being ends plays no role. It plays no role. Same thing is true if you have to do, surgery and amputation means suffering a significant injury. If somebody amputated someone's foot for no reason whatsoever, he'd be a terrible criminal. So it's an action which, under other circumstances, we would regard as criminal. And here we wouldn't regard it as criminal. But that isn't the issue. The issue is whether it's criminal or not. The issue is that you, as the person who has the gangrene in his foot, what is the reasonable thing for him to do? And it seems clear that what's reasonable for him to do is have the surgery and live 30 years. That argumentation I just presented in the last 90 seconds, the difference between means and ends played no role at all. So maybe you have some extra philosophical issue that you're interested in for its own sake, what it means and ends, and when one can justify the other, and so on. But that's from the point of view of practical life, that's free play. That's what you do, after you retire. There's nothing practically relevant to it. Nothing relevant in terms of making the correct decision. I think people used means and ends wrongly to try to make this decision, and as I said, I think it only leads to confusion. Yeah.
I would like perhaps to see how the rabbi sees another example, which would be, let's say, a person has to commit fraud to make a certain amount of money. So, or not commit fraud and stay poor. So, how are we seeing these futures, which?
So there are two questions now. I was talking about what is rational for the person to do in terms of his own benefit.
Right.
Now you're talking about a moral question, but I think the moral question is exactly the same. After all, what we regard as morally permissible or impermissible depends upon circumstances. Can I take your car against your will and drive it to where I want to go?
Generally speaking, no.
Right, that's exactly the right answer. Generally speaking, no. But if my life is on the line, and if I don't get to the hospital, and the only way I can get there is by taking your car, and you want to go for a drive in the forest, many people would say, under those conditions, you have an obligation to save my life, and if you're not willing to do it, some people would argue that it's permissible for me to take your car because my taking your car is a violation far, far less serious than my life being lost. So I think that in this way you can see that sort of thing. Let's take, for example, a slightly more complicated case where you have a legislature, right? Now, generally speaking, it's wrong to take someone's property against his will. That makes no difference whether the person taking the property is an individual or a group or the majority of the society. Just to go and take his property is wrong. It's theft. It's theft when 80% of the population does it. And if the 80% of the population pass a law that says you can take the property of Jews, as it was in Europe often, at will, that just means that the 80% are robbers. And that the democratic system here has committed a terrible crime, right? But then let's say that we need a road to be built. If that road is built, it will create jobs and stimulate the economy, and there'll be more contributions to the hospitals, and everything will get better. And there are 16 people whose houses are in the way. Then we have something called eminent domain, where the legislature can claim those houses, pay the people for them, move them out forcibly if they don't want to leave, for the sake of the greater good of the entire society. Would you just call that theft? Probably not, because they're sitting there is something which is depriving a lot of people of a lot of benefit. So under those conditions, it would be okay to take their property against their will, and maybe you wouldn't call it bad. We wouldn't call it theft anymore. So I think that whether these things are, in terms of a morally right thing to do, also, whether it's morally right to do it depends upon the circumstances. Something which in some circumstances is morally wrong, in other circumstances becomes morally right. So I think that, but it's the package deal. And this is what libertarians will tell you, right? You're taxing the rich to service the poor. You're Robin Hood. You're just stealing from people. Nice guy. You stole their money and then you use it for something which is beneficial. But you can't steal money. Sorry, you can't do that. This person will say, I'm sorry. Even though you get a great benefit out of it, you're not allowed to steal in order to create a benefit. That's a concrete moral issue. That's what I hinted at 12 minutes ago when I said I'm speaking as a consequentialist, and I know that they're deontologists. So at that point, the moral question it becomes a live question, right? But calling the one ends and one means doesn't help that question. It isn't as if you could say, well, these are only means, so they're less important. They're less significant. And the ends have more power because those are the things that are really important and valuable. So then maybe it's easier to justify these than those because they're less significant. No, that's not true. Right. The means have a value. The ends have a value. All the future events have a value. And the values have to be calculated against one another. Okay, that's one classification.
Yeah, but still, in a classic example, kill one to save 5 lives. I mean, you can look at this in a kind of...
So normally,
how are you going to assess that?
That's right. Normally, we do not allow the idea of killing one person to take his body parts to save 5 people.
So there are kind of principles, constraints on this kind of...
That's right, because we are not utilitarians.
Right. Okay.
Utility is a moral factor, but there are certain deontological rules which are also moral factors. And in each concrete case, it has to be argued out in detail, and sometimes it's very difficult to justify one conclusion over another. Morality has a lot of gray areas. There's no question about that. Yeah.
So a lot of these questions being discussed, are these not examples of a question of whether the ends justify the means? And are these not examples of where that's an important part of the decision-making process?
In order, let me see if I can say what I'm saying in a different way. So the point
Should
we
I
get.
tax the rich?
Answer me this question. If I asked this question before, and you're not, I don't hear that you're answering my question. My question is, if someone had never heard of ends and means, and he was trying to make a decision what to do, whether what's of greatest benefit to himself or what is right and wrong to do, and he never heard of ends and means, show me where, because he never heard of ends and means, he's going to make the wrong decision. If you can't show me where leaving ends and means out of it altogether leads you to a wrong decision, then I say that it's certainly superfluous, because it doesn't make any difference. When you decide in this case of eminent domain, right? I didn't imply that, well, taking the houses is only a means. It's a means to the end of building the road, and therefore, I didn't use that. I simply said that with the road, there'll be more jobs and more money, more hospitals, and everything else, and they will suffer the fact that they lost their houses, and it's worth it because their suffering can't match the gigantic benefit for society. Those words don't say or imply anything about ends and means. They're just things that are going to happen. They're going to lose their houses, they're going to be unhappy, there'll be a road, there'll be more money, and the society will get a certain benefit. End of story. I think that's enough to arrive at a rational conclusion about what you should do. Adding in that, well, taking away the houses is a means, and getting the road and the extra money is the end, does nothing to give you any understanding of what the right decision is.
However, in the case of that you mentioned with killing one person or in taxing the rich for the poor, if you just look at the outcomes, in one case the poor will have more money, in the other they won't. Or in one case 5 people will live, in one case 1 person will live. The outcome would say to do it means the question of whether the means justify the end. Make it a question.
You mean ends justify the means? But no, that's not correct. I can explain the dilemma, the moral dilemma, in a way that doesn't use the concept or the terminology of ends and means altogether. And by the way, this is the way it's usually explained, without ends and means altogether. You have 2 alternatives. You leave the situation as it is, and 5 people die, and 1 person lives. You kill him and use his parts to be able to save them, and you end up with 1 person dead and 5 people alive. What should you do? Now, a consequentialist will say, kill him and take the parts. A person who has deontological rules says there are certain things that you cannot do, even if they will produce greater consequences. There are certain things that you can't do, period. And you can't do them, you cannot do for that purpose, for this purpose of taking. A deontologist will say you're wrong to make consequences the only moral factor. There are certain moral rules about action which are an independent moral factor and compete with the consequences, and you have to take them into account. None of that verbiage makes use of the idea of means and ends. It's just, you got 1 package deal, kill a person and 5 people continue to live. Got another package deal, don't kill him, 5 die and 1 continues to live. And now, and kill him is the, which package deal is the correct, morally correct package deal? One has killing and 5 surviving, one has no killing and 1 surviving. That's what you're trying to. The question is whether the killing can be used for, it makes it a better or worse package. Means and ends play no role in that argumentation. The other classification, which ties into this, is you can divide things that happen or actions, which are also events, into 3 categories. There's some that are good. There's some that are evil but necessary, and there's some that are evil and unnecessary. Necessary means that something else depends upon them, and if they don't happen, the other thing won't happen. And the other thing is good. So, there's no problem about good. Something that's evil but necessary is by definition a means, because the only thing that justifies it is needed for the consequence. That being the case, as I said at the beginning, when you talk about means and ends, if you could get the end without it, then it's not necessary. If it's not necessary, you're not going to tolerate it, because it is evil. So, something that's evil but necessary is really evil. But you might use your vocabulary this way. There's evil and absolute evil. And absolute evil would be an unnecessary evil. And evil, without the word absolute, could refer to evils which are necessary. What do I mean when I say that it's evil when it's necessary? So let me give you just a little application of this idea, so to make it hopefully comfortable, and then I'll try to explain more precisely what it means. We talk about people having a decision, and a person says, I had two alternatives, A and B, and I chose the lesser evil. And it was right to choose the lesser evil. Let's think what those words mean. Listen to what's being said here. This is where some people's imaginations go off rails. How could it be right to choose something evil? How could that be right? Doesn't the word right make it morally, enshrined and morally wonderful and morally, this is what moral people will do. They'll do the right thing. And this is the right thing to do. How can you call it evil? But as you know from life, there are times when you have two alternatives and they're both evil, and what you do is you choose the lesser evil, and that's the right thing to do. So if that's so, calling it right doesn't make it good. Calling it right may mean that it's the lesser of two evils, but it is certainly evil. Now, if you ask, well, if A is necessary for B and B is a good, why doesn't that make A good? Why doesn't that automatically imply that A is good? Why do you call it only a necessary evil? And one way to answer that question is this. Let's suppose you're looking at A, and you're asking, what's the status of A? In particular, let's suppose the agent who does A is an agent with a good reputation. An agent is someone who you trust. And you say, why did he do that? How can you explain the fact that he, such a good person, reliable person, did that? Now, there are two ways you could respond. One way you could respond is, you don't know what he was doing. Why did he pull his gun and deliberately shoot that guy? Why did he do that? The answer is because that guy was aiming to shoot somebody else, and he was preventing murder. Oh, I didn't know he was trying to kill somebody else. I didn't know that in shooting him, he was preventing murder. I thought in shooting him, he was just cold-bloodedly causing his death. I didn't know what he was doing. The extra conditions changed the character of what he did. That's one way. But then, suppose someone says, look, you're right, A looks bad, there's no question about it, and it does need an explanation, but A was necessary for B, and the package of A and B is an appropriate package. Here you have to ask yourself, why is he justifying A by appealing to its relationship with B? Why is he doing that? Isn't it because he can't show you that A itself is good? Because if A itself was good, he wouldn't appeal to its relationship to something else. When you justify something by saying it's related to something else that's good, you've given up on that thing. That thing you are yourself declaring to be evil. Because if it weren't, that would be your defense. Your defense would be that it's not evil, you're making a mistake, you don't know what's going on. It wasn't murder, it was preventing murder. So the very fact that you justify on the grounds that this A is related to B and the package of A and B is worth it, shows you that A alone is something which you couldn't justify. That's why it's called a necessary evil. It's incorrect to say that if A leads to B and A is necessary to get to B and B is a good, that makes A good. No, it doesn't. A's being good is different from A's being a necessary means to get to B. They're two different propositions, two different ideas. Now, when we come to a perfect agent, what do we want of a perfect agent? Do we want a perfect agent that he never does any evil at all? Well, let's take an example. I lived through this example. I don't know if you're as old as I am. Maybe I did or did not live through it. Once upon a time, inoculating children against various diseases was done by needle. big, fat, strong needles, not the microfine needles that we have today. It was very painful. Now, and usually the father and a couple of older brothers had to be taken along when you go into the doctor because the child didn't want it, and he knew from last year what it was like, and he was ready to run, had to be held down. That's the way it is. Fine.
In the tuches?
Hmm?
In the tuches?
Yeah, usually there's no tuchus. It's hard to miss there. If you're looking for a vein, it can be very difficult. So, how shall we evaluate the doctor as an agent? Let's see. He performed an action which inoculated the child against disease and caused him pain. Inoculating the child against disease is good, causing him pain is bad. Shall I say that the doctor is, well, look, he did something that's partly good and partly bad, so the doctor must be a mixed package. There must be some secret, vicious motivation in him that enjoys pain, that he because otherwise, why would he cause the child pain? So he can't be morally perfect, because one of the things he did is he immunized him, and the other thing is he caused him pain, right? We don't think that way about the doctor. Why not? Because from the point of view of physical medicine, there was a period in time when that was the only way to do it. Now, if you'll suggest, this is like we said before, and I'm doing it again, you suggest, but look, how can the pain that caused the child be evil, since it was part of producing his immunization, and his immunization is good, so doesn't that make the pain good? It doesn't, and I'll prove it to you. Because next year when they invent the pill, you don't expect the doctor to use the needle, do you? If the doctor uses the needle, he's going to put him in jail. Why? You're telling me the pain is part of the good of immunizing him, so the pain is also good. No, it isn't. The pain is an evil. The justification for the pain is that it's a necessary evil. Well, that means that the doctor, as an agent, is perfect, even if he does evil, when the evil is necessary for a good, and should be a good that's large enough to justify this amount of evil. So then, if you want to describe the perfection of an agent, you don't want to say that the agent does only good. So now if we're going to describe God as a perfect agent, that's a qualification, perfect agent. That's a very important qualification. It may be the crucial qualification. It's a more general point. We could discuss it if you like. But if you start with the idea we're discussing God as a perfect agent, then the existence of evil in the world is not necessarily a contradiction to the perfection of his agency. If it can be shown that the evil is necessary for the sake of producing a greater good, then God's agency is perfect, perfectly moral, even though he creates evil. Now, as I told you the other day, our sources say that he does create evil. I have a whole share on this, it's recorded. The verse in Isaiah says, Yeshivat Ohr Somayach, he creates evil. And the verse in Genesis says that man's spirit is evil from his youth. And the Talmud comments, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, afilu yotzro kra'o ra. Even its creator calls it evil. And he created it. The Torah calls it evil, and God created that spirit in man. So he definitely creates evil. And there's a Mishnah in Brachos which says that there's a blessing to make when something good happens to you, and a blessing to make when something evil happens to you. Which means not only do good and evil things happen, but also we can tell the difference. Not infallibly, nothing human is infallible, but often we can reliably tell the difference because this is a prescription for practical action. Which blessing shall I make, Rabbi? And you describe to him what happened, and he tells you, make this blessing or make that blessing. Those sources, on the face of them, tell you that evil things happen. The question is, what kind of evil things happen? Are they necessary evils for the sake of some greater good? Or are they absolute evils? That's what we will deny. God never does anything that's absolutely evil. Evil, disconnected. And And the evils that he does create are necessary for greater good. The Ramchal, well, it's either the Ramchal or a student of his. It's a matter of scholarly debate. There's a sefer called Klach Piskei Chachma, deep sefer on Kabbalah. In the beginning, he gives the following example. Against people who disagree with me and who say, no, everything's good. Everything that God does is good. No such thing as being evil. It's not true. The goodness of God prevents him from doing anything evil of any kind, necessary, unnecessary. It's just a mistake. So I'm paraphrasing the Ramchal's example, his thought. He says, I want you to imagine a world. And in this world, there is a single spirit. Spirit, like a human soul, let's say, that can think and can feel, can experience. And the only thing that happens in this world, in this universe, is toothache. Toothache forever. Just toothache. Not toothache in tshuva, not toothache in prayer, not toothache in kindness to other people or sensitivity to other people, not toothache in the world to come. Toothache forever. Just toothache forever. Says the author of that sefer, I think you will fail the challenge to discover and explain how it's possible that just toothache forever should be good. When we talk about things that look bad being good, usually what we mean is, either one of two things. Either you don't understand what's happening, like the killing the fellow who's really preventing a murder, or it leads to some other very good consequence which justifies it. But if you cut both of those out, just toothache forever, then you get something which isn't good at all. And therefore, that kind of thing, we will say, God doesn't do. So that means that necessary evils are a category, and they are a category which we do associate with God. So this is what we find with, I said the other night, but I didn't elaborate on it, the two statements in the Talmud which describe the attitude that God's running the world and everything's okay, from Nachum Ish Gamzu and from Rabbi Kiva, both have in it the crucial lamed, Gamzu Litova. This too is for good. Not this too is good. And I've heard people make this mistake. If Nachum Ish Gamzu had meant to say, evil is an illusion, there is no such thing as evil, everything that happens in God's world is good, then he shouldn't have put in the lamed. He shouldn't have said this too is for good, he should have said this too is good. This too, which looks to you evil, is really good. He didn't say that. He says connect it to something else. If you have to justify something by connecting it to something else, then what you're saying is that it in and of itself isn't good. And that means you're admitting a category of evil. Rabbi Kiva said exactly the same thing. So, is your hand up?
Yeah.
Okay, yes.
No, just a quick point. I'm just noticing you pointed out the two ways how an evil can be a necessary evil. Either you're not realizing what's going on here, and in fact it's a good. The guy was trying to kill someone else, so he's killing him. He's saving a life, not he's saving an innocent life, not killing one. Or perhaps it was for a necessary. It was a necessary evil for a good outcome.
Hold on. Let me recite back to you your words and see whether you really want to affirm them. You said that I presented two ways in which an evil could be justified.
Mm-hmm.
Either the evil
is good.
That's not a way in which an evil is justified, is it?
Right.
That what you're discovering there is that it wasn't an evil.
Right.
So that isn't what needs to be said. There are two ways to deal with an apparent evil. One is to say that it's only apparent, isn't evil at all, it really is good. It in and of itself is good. And the other is to say, no, you're right, it is an evil, but it's an evil that leads to good.
Right.
And that means that what you're really going to be against is an evil, a real evil that doesn't lead to good. That's what I said. Yeah, now.
So my question just is that the first possibility that it's not an evil, it's really a good. Isn't that also really just the second thing? Because in the example given, where the guy he was killing was trying to kill someone, isn't that also just, isn't it still an evil to take a life? But again, because it was necessary to take that life to prevent it from performing an act of aggression and taking an innocent life, that would, and it wasn't necessary.
I don't think so. Let me give you an example. I think there's a fairly subtle point here, and it's a point worth meditating on in and of itself. We could have a vocabulary, a locution that we'll use in English. Why did you do A for the sake of B? I did A for the sake of B. I think that locution gets two different explanations. I think the two are very different. Let's imagine that you see me building a tower in my backyard. You say, why are you building a tower in your backyard? I say, see that hill over there? I want to be able to see over that hill. And I figured out that if I have a 30-foot tower, then I'll be able to see the view on the other side that I want to see. So I'm building the tower in order to see over that hill. That's one case. Second case, you see me building a tower in George's backyard. Okay, Gottleib, I got the first one, but this one's harder to understand. Why are you building a tower in George's backyard? So I'll tell you why. Because George did me a terrific favor, and I owe him a lot. And I checked around and found out that what he wants is a tower in his backyard. He's on vacation in the Bahamas. He's going to be away for 30 days. By the time he comes back, he'll have a tower in his backyard. I'm building the tower in order to repay his favor. Now, let's compare the two cases. In the first case, I'm building the tower in order to see over the hill. In the second case, I'm building the tower in order to repay his favor. Now let's imagine, in my case, I'm building a tower in my backyard. I finish it at midnight. I think we'll have to say, oh, wow, Baruch Hashem, it's finished. Tomorrow, I'll finally be able to see over the hill. That's a means to an end. You're doing A for the sake of B, and B is different from A. They're separated even in time. But when I finish building the tower in George's backyard, that is the favor. The favor is that he has a tower in his backyard. Building the tower and repaying the favor is the same action. It's just an extra description of the action that you weren't aware of. Why are you building a tower in somebody else's backyard? Because this building of the tower in the backyard is repaying a favor. And it's the fact that it is repaying a favor, which gives the reason why I do it. So the reason doesn't have to be a means to an end, something else which is connected to. It's a different description of the very same thing that I'm doing. Right? Now, it's not the same as it's done for the sake of something else. It's connected to something else because there's no something else. There's just building the tower. Now, you see me handing $500 to somebody. I use this example, but I'm going to elaborate differently now. Okay? And you say, why are you doing that? I said, well, I said, I owe him the money. So my handing him the money is paying the loan. That explains why I'm handing it to him. That's not means to end. I'm not trying to accomplish something else. I'm explaining what's in the action of handing the money over that motivates me to do this action. It's another description that applies to what I did. And if I said that I'm bribing him, then and bribing him not to persecute or to vote some way, then I'm giving the money so that tomorrow he'll vote. So then the giving of the money is supposed to produce some other effect independently of it, which it serves. But here it's nothing independent. There's just handing the $500. And now that you know that I borrowed money, this is repaying the loan. So and we do say I'm paying the money in order to repay the loan. But the words in order to can be read in two different ways. In order to can be linking what I'm doing here to some other consequence in the future. Or it can be another description of what I'm doing right here and now, which changes your understanding and your appreciation for what I'm doing now. The philosophers talked about this 30 years ago. The example was lifting up and waving your hand, by which you are signaling the spy to detonate the bomb. So what are you doing with your hand? Well, I'm waving it, and I'm signaling the spy. And both of them are what I'm doing. They're just different descriptions of what I'm doing. waving your hand is innocent, and signaling the spy to detonate the bomb is not innocent. So once you know that other description, you come to see it in a different way. So when you talk about doing A for the sake of B, or in order to accomplish B, the in order to doesn't mean that it's a means to end relationship or a necessary condition relationship. It can be just another description of the same thing. And this is very, very important because, for example, you have different statements as to why God created the world from the same author, and he himself or the commentators try to explain how they're related. The Ramchal, for example, the Derech Hashem starts by saying God's purpose in creating the world is to benefit, creates a world of beneficiaries to whom he can give benefit. And in other, more philosophical works, he talks about something called Gilu Yichud, revealing that the appearance of multiple agencies in the world is only a false appearance, and there really is only one agency. You say, well, he said, this is the purpose, and this is the purpose. Like, so, why do you have two different descriptions? Now, you might say, oh, revealing God's sole agency is a means to the good that will come out of it. You could say that. But you could say that the process of revealing the agency is the good for which he created the world. You didn't realize that that's a good. You don't realize the benefit that's in it. But you have to understand that it is a benefit. Just revealing the agency is a benefit. So then, it's not two different events, one leading to the other. It's two different descriptions of the same event. You say, yes, what is it? So, let's say in practical terms, it's revealing God's sole agency, and in motivational terms, it's doing benefit, and the same event happens to be both. I think philosophically, it's very important to keep clear the difference between A leading to B, or A and B being both descriptions of the same event. Okay, so now this means that we are going to tolerate the idea that God creates evil, and then the job is only to look for what the evil is necessary for. And here, the final thing to be said, which needs to be elaborated in detail, is someone should object to the whole discussion this evening in principle by saying, what do you mean it's necessary? Rabbi, you cheated. You used the example of a human doctor. Well, he isn't all-powerful. So we can understand that for a human doctor, it might be necessary to use the needle until next year, until they invent the pill. But you're talking about God. You're going to say that for God, he does A because he can't get from A to B without using A as a means to B. And that's why he does A, which is evil, because it's a necessary means to that end. God can do anything. Why can't God just create B directly? That's an appropriate logical question, and it has an answer. The answer is when A and B are related by causality, A causes B, new taxes cause a surplus, which causes the building of hospitals or something like that, then you could possibly ask that question. But when A and B are related by logic, so that proposing that God should do B without A would be equivalent to supposing that God should make a square circle, that's where Jewish philosophers get off the train. We do not describe God in contradictory terms. The Rambam says it, the Malbim says it, anyone who's discussed it agrees, we do not describe God in contradictory terms. Particularly, you don't describe anything in contradictory terms, but certainly you don't describe what God should or could do in contradictory terms. Why you don't is a very difficult question. Maimonides wrote about it. I don't understand what he's talking about. I don't know anybody else that does. I haven't checked everybody, obviously. I have an explanation on the basis of modern philosophy, which I can give, which I think is quite satisfactory. But the bottom line is, if your description, you say, why doesn't God do X? And we analyze your description very carefully, and you see that X itself, when you take it apart, contains a clear contradiction, the question goes away. We don't ask that question because the using contradictory words doesn't present an alternative to be done. Now, I mentioned that very briefly the other night. Ramchal himself says that although God is all-powerful, we would not describe God as making an equal to himself, making another God. Why not? God could do anything. That's just a thing, isn't it? Well, not really, because God, by definition, isn't made. God is uncreated. God exists because his existence is necessary in and of itself. So to say that God makes God or a God would mean that God made something which was created and uncreated. He made it so it's created, and it's uncreated because it's God. And that's a contradiction, and we don't talk that way. So it could, in this case, by the way, this is on my website. It's called Omnipotence and Evil, Part 1. If you're going to talk about why God doesn't use his omnipotence to get to the end without the means, you have to be very careful that the means and ends aren't related as a contradiction. They're related externally. If that's true, then it's a valid question. But it's not true, then it's not a valid question. And there are cases, in particular free will, creating a world with evil in it, without which the good that God wants to accomplish, which is the greatest possible good, isn't consistently described. It can't be consistently described, and therefore it can't be asked why he doesn't do that. That is the second part of the argument, which I haven't hinted at tonight. Question? Yeah. No. Okay, this is deep background, and this will help in the study of Job, which we will go back to tomorrow in session.
My question just was that I had heard that answer from you and found it satisfactory, and then in another speech from someone else, where the same question of God's omnipotence versus evil was posed, the person mentioned that Kabbalah does believe in the possibility of, basically doesn't believe in saying that Hashem can't do contradictions. How do we understand that Kabbalah?
I would like to know his source. Kabbalah is very big. There are thousands of pages. I would like to know his source. The key problem is because, in terms of my explanation, when you contradict yourself when you speak,
You didn't ask a question.
you're not making any sense. The words are nonsensical. They don't communicate an idea. So the question of whether God can or cannot do it doesn't arise because there's no it being described.
You haven't asked the question.
So, right. My example to this is like, I have to introduce my friend George. He is a portrait painter. He is the universal portrait painter. He can paint any age, any ethnic group, any race, both sexes, every possible mood. He is the universal portrait painter. And somebody says, no, he isn't. No, he isn't. Show me that he can paint Santa Claus. Now, I hope I'm not breaking your hearts, but, there is no Santa Claus, okay? Don't go home and cry. So now, is this really a shortcoming in George that he can't paint Santa Claus? A portrait painter paints portraits of people. Santa Claus isn't a people. So therefore, it's not a shortcoming that he doesn't paint Santa Claus, right? And you're going to tell me, God could paint Santa Claus after all. There's no limits on what God can do. Sorry. Paint Santa Claus is nonsense. Portrait paint. You can have descriptive paint, because portrait paint means paint a human, and here there's no human, right? So I think that things that are inconsistent like that, there's no point in describing them in terms of what God can and cannot do. Yeah.
You mentioned a long time ago this idea how to respond to a challenge that goes up against our intuitions that poses like a logical challenge to it. So the case was, someone tells me they can prove to me I don't have hands, right? They show me a whole logical proof and how it all makes sense and so on, but I have hands. It's right here in front of me. People ask this question because they seem to have a strong intuition that there is a problem here. And you're responding by saying, well, you're not saying anything that makes sense, but how do you know that what you're doing here is not similar, like bringing this tight argument to deflect people's intuition that is actually something pretty valid, because people seem to keep asking the question and thinking it has content, similar to how even though they can't break down what their hand is and what makes it work, they really feel like they have a hand.
Well, I don't think that's, you're talking about G.E. Moore's thing, what he used to do at Cambridge, was refute idealism. It's not a question of feelings. And if you're asking me how I know infallibly that I must be correct and it's impossible that I'm making a mistake, I never claimed infallibility. I never say it's impossible to make a mistake. I don't believe in infallibility, and so forth and so on. If you ask me what justification I have against their feeling, my justification is this. I can explain why they feel what they feel. Not just opposing, I can explain why they feel it that way. And I ask them, are you suggesting that maybe what I think is a contradiction isn't really a contradiction? That happens. We make mistakes about what are contradictions. Discover to our surprise that maybe there is a way of making it true. That's not the issue. The issue is contradictions don't describe anything. Separate from that is this a contradiction or isn't this a contradiction? The person who says, you misunderstood it, there's a consistent way to understand it, isn't attacking the idea that contradictions don't describe. He's saying this isn't a contradiction. Indeed, if he's working hard to show it isn't a contradiction, it sounds like he agrees with me. That contradictions really are in trouble. That's why he's working so hard to show that it isn't a contradiction.
I think the person might also think that he's speaking in a way that's akin to...
I'll tell you what he thinks. Okay. What he thinks is you can't say God can't do something. To say God can't do something is to put limitations on him, and God can't be limited. And what he's missing here is we're not saying God can't do something. We're saying no something has been described. It's exactly the same mistake as Santa Claus for the poor child, poor 8-year-old who thinks there is a Santa Claus. Of course God can paint Santa Claus. Why can't he paint Santa? He should give him a present in the North Pole. Give him a present of a painting. If he thinks there is a Santa Claus, then he will have to say that, of course, my friend George can paint him because he's the universal portrait painter. But I want to know whether after he agrees that there is no Santa Claus, he still thinks that George can't, or if he can't paint him, that it's a failure, that somehow George is less than universal. He thinks that, I don't think he can explain what he means. At that point, I think, it's not just my intuitions against his. I can explain where he's coming from, I can explain what the alternatives are, and he's not responding to my explanation. It still doesn't prove that I have to be right, but it's a good reason to think I'm right in the meantime. Yeah.
So now we were talking about I wanted to say the Tzelem Elokim, how could it be seen in the sense that Hashem does create creatures which somehow we know that possess God-like features and qualities.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we understand that in the frame of Hashem's complete independence, or like like are we saying that all we know is through the creatures, like all we know from Hashem is through the creatures, since it's in such level of independence?
In your words, there are like 3 or 4 different questions floating around.
Right.
I
was trying to make it because
if you tell me that there can't be anything similar to God because God is too far beyond or is infinite or whatever it is, that's one thing. You talk about if it's going to be similar to God and a creature, it's going to be independent, and nothing can be independent of God, that's another thing. I mean, you have to decide exactly what the question is supposed to be. God-like just means sharing some quality.
Yeah.
That doesn't make him into God. Right? Things that aren't God can share some qualities with God. Right? Like chesed, acts of loving kindness. God does acts of loving kindness, and we do acts of loving kindness. There's a difference in degree, but they both deserve the same overall title. They're acts of loving kindness. So then there's a similarity between us. Now, that's not going to compromise any of God's infinity and greatness and independence and all the rest. Independence means it doesn't depend upon us. It doesn't mean we couldn't be similar to us. him in particular doesn't mean he can't create us similar to him. Indeed, saying that we couldn't be similar to him, that's a limitation. Because then you say he hasn't got the power to create something similar to himself. Why not? The question is, what's similarity? He can't create something that's uncreated, like he's uncreated. That he can't do. Because you can't create something that's uncreated. But you can create something which is capable of kindness, just as he's capable of kindness. Why not? What would stop him from doing that? No contradiction there.
Well, just a little more. So, is it said somewhere that whatever we know from those from Hashem, is it only through the features that we've been created with? Like we are only enabled to see certain things which are part of the input in the way we were created? Like
sure. I mean, we are given certain capabilities of acquiring knowledge, senses and mind and logic and other things. And of course, we can only appreciate the things that those sources will give us. And again, the sources may mislead us. And so we may make mistakes and draw false inferences from the things that we see. But none of that is what's in question here. What's in question here is when you're talking about the possibility of Q, you're talking about Q. You want to reason about Q. You want to ask questions about Q. Then you have a responsibility that Q should make sense. If the words you use in describing Q don't make sense, then you have failed to raise a question. That's not a limitation on God. It's a limitation on you. That's where the false projection comes. I said, can God do A, B, C, D, E? It's all English. It's all spelled out, right? What's wrong? What's wrong is A, B, C, D, E doesn't make sense. And therefore, you haven't asked the question. Yeah.
Just jumping off of this then, how do we deal with the question of can God create something that is independent of himself?
He can't, because to create it means it's not independent. To create it means it depends on him. That's like creating something that's uncreated.
Can he create something to just exist now?
You mean create it in such a way that afterwards it will continue to exist without his input? Mm-hmm. He certainly can. Ramchal says explicitly that he can. So much so that he asks why he didn't do it.
free will.
Right.
No, not free will, a table, a star. God could make the star. We say every morning twice, Mechadish Tobi Ma'aser Bereishis. God is renewing the work of the creation continuously. Ramchal asks, why is God doing that? He's all-powerful. He could create something that doesn't need his constant input. Why didn't he do it? Certainly perfectly sensible to describe the world that way, and he can ask why he didn't, and he gives an answer. Right? So that's not a problem. Create something that will be thereafter independent of him, yes, he could do that.
What was his answer?
Sorry?
What was his answer?
His answer was that God created us for the sake of attachment to him, vekus, and therefore he has to be available. If he creates the world and then absents himself from it and lets it run on its own, vekus won't be possible because he will not be available for us to interact with. And therefore he constantly recreates it with his will. Therefore everything that's in front of you is the activity of his will, and therefore he's available. He gives a spiritual answer to a metaphysical question.
Right. I mean, why, although a kind of non-consequential thing, some rock somewhere in the desert, for that to have been created, and actually
Okay, we're spinning off from question to question. If you look up Max